The Subcommittee on National Security will come to order. Without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare a recess at any time. This hearing will conduct oversight over the enhancement due to the Obama administration's nuclear deal of Iran's current capabilities to project power by reviewing Iran's own military arsenal as well as its financing, training, and army of proxy groups throughout the Middle East. The hearing will also examine how the U.S. should be prepared to defend its national security interests in the Middle East and at home against Iran's advancement in power projection as a result of sanctions relief. It has been reported that Iran's defense budget makes up one-third of its national $300 billion budget. If these estimates are accurate, an influx of $100 billion due to sanctions relief would increase Iran's single-year budget by a third, providing it with substantially increased financial resources to further its foreign policy agenda. It is well known that Iran projects power in the Middle East through the funding of foreign terrorist organizations, hostile governments, and political activist movements, and by arming militant groups and offering training facilities. Iran has long been a supporter of the Lebanese group Hezbollah, the, quote, vanguard of resistance to Israel, end quote. Hezbollah is perhaps Iran's most effective terrorist organization within the region and, of course, was responsible for killing more than 240 Americans at the Marine Corps barracks in Beirut in 1983. With Iran's financial and military assistance, Hezbollah has become a prominent influence in Lebanese politics. The State Department estimates that Iran has given Hezbollah hundreds of millions of dollars and trained thousands of Hezbollah troops at Iranian training facilities. In 2014, the U.S. intelligence community worldwide threat assessment argued that Hezbollah has, quote, increased its global terrorist activity in recent years to a level that we have not seen since the 1990s, end quote. Further Iranian funding of Hezbollah would be, of course, of serious concern to the U.S. Our allies. Has also consistently received funds, weapons, and training from Iran. And people talk about Iran being a Shiite power. They're absolutely willing to arm Sunni groups like Hamas. And then when you have decent Shiite governments like in Azerbaijan, Iran is opposed to that. Iran has frequently assisted Shiite militias and terrorists in Iraq, Bahrain, and Yemen. For these reasons, Iran has been designated by the State Department as a state sponsor of terrorism since 1984. Iran is maintaining and expanding an advanced ballistic and cruise missile program that poses a threat to U.S. forces, interests, and allies in the Gulf region and beyond. The recently signed nuclear accord does not limit Iran's ability to continue to develop its ballistic and cruise missile programs. The potential influx of funding as a result of sanction relief may facilitate the advancement of Iran's ballistic and cruise missile programs, which will result in Iran posing an even more lethal threat to the United States and our allied assets in the region. Our military leaders understand the threat posed by Iran. During his confirmation hearing in July for JCS Chairman, Marine Corps General Joe Dunford said, quote, my expectation is that regardless of there being an agreement or not, Iran will continue to be a malign force and influence across the region, end quote. Retired Marine Corps General Jim Jones further elaborated on this threat during testimony before the Senate Armed Services Committee hearing last month. He said, in quote, it is a regime that artfully dodges its commitments, generates international friction to exert greater domestic control on its citizens, constantly hardens its grip on the country. The mullah's government seriously violates human rights, UN Security Council resolutions, and international law. They reject the right of Israel to exist by opposing and actively undermining the Middle East peace process. And Tehran remains the chief antagonist of democracy and liberalization across the Middle East, where a better future for millions of people struggles to emerge. Its goal is the consolidation of the revolution, which is martially enforced at home by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and prosecuted abroad by the Quds Force and Iran's many proxy groups, end quote. And I think it's worth pointing out that under the agreement with the Obama administration, the international sanctions on the Quds Force are actually lifted. Sanctions relief will exacerbate Iran's ability to pursue a nefarious foreign policy agenda. Israeli officials have warned that Tehran will direct billions of dollars it will reap from the end of economic sanctions toward its anti-Israel proxies in the region. Iranian officials often call for Israel's destruction. Short of that, proxy forces like Hezbollah, Hamas, and Palestinian Islamic Jihad provide Tehran with a shield against a possible Israeli military strike on its nuclear program. And I would note today, in the Wall Street Journal, we have on the front page, Iranian hacking surges in the U.S. And so here you have an agreement. We claim that Iran is going to start to change its ways, and we're going to, they're not going to have a military use of nuclear energy, but yet how are they responding to that? They're hacking inside the United States. So Iran's foreign policy will remain at odds with U.S. interests. And so with this understanding, we must turn to the task of protecting U.S. national security issues and the job of standing by our closest allies in the region. And so we are delighted to have such a great group of witnesses here for our hearing, and I will recognize them in a minute. But before I do that, I'd like to recognize the ranking member of the Subcommittee on National Security, Mr. Lynch, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you for holding this important hearing. I also want to thank our witnesses for helping the committee out with its work. There's no doubt that Iran is a destabilizing force in the Middle East, and I agree with the quote by General Dunford that they will continue to be so in the future. The United States first placed Iran on its terrorist list in 1984 due to its support of Lebanese Hezbollah. In its most recent country terrorism report, the State Department found that throughout 2014, Iran did continue to support terrorist groups, including Hezbollah, in providing financing, training, and arms to Iraqi Shia militia and even some Afghan fighters to bolster Bashar al-Assad in Syria. Iran has also detained American hikers and journalists, and most recently is reported to have arrested 2 American citizens on unspecified charges. It's clear that we cannot trust the Iranian regime, but that is precisely why the Obama administration has worked so hard to reduce their nuclear weapons capabilities. I believe that the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, also known as the Iran Nuclear Agreement, offers us the most viable path toward limiting Iran's nuclear program and preventing its future development of a nuclear weapon. In referencing the nuclear arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union in his 1960 inaugural address, President Kennedy remarked that, quote, "Sincerity is always subject to proof," close quote. The Iran nuclear agreement does not require us to simply rely on the sincerity of the Iranian leadership. Rather, it depends entirely on proof in the form of a robust nuclear inspections and verification regime conducted by the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency. To be clear, the lifting of nuclear-related United Nations and European Union sanctions will only occur after IAEA verification that Iran has complied with its end of the deal. Specifically, the IAEA must monitor and verify that Iran has met a variety of stipulations required by the agreement. For instance, Iran must reduce its total uranium stockpiles by 97%, from 10,000 kilos to 300 immediately. It must also reduce the number of centrifuges from 19,000 to about 6,000, which Iran has reportedly already begun to do so. The IAEA must also verify that Iran does not produce or retain any weapons-grade uranium, and the little low-enriched uranium remaining is to be for commercial and scientific uses only. The IAEA must monitor and verify the dismantling of the heavy water reactor at Iran's water plant in Arak so that it will no longer be able to produce weapons-grade plutonium. These are just a few of the substantial physical and verifiable reductions that Iran must undertake. The Treasury Department estimates that upon implementation of the agreement, Iran will have access to between $100 billion and $125 billion in foreign exchange assets held in the U.S., EU, and mostly Asian banks, a lot of which is already obligated, including nearly $20 billion owed to China. In all, experts anticipate Iran to use the vast majority of these funds to pay down current debt obligations and domestic needs, estimated to be over $500 billion. These needs include as much as $200 billion in necessary oil infrastructure investments and the purchase of commercial aircraft to replace a deteriorated domestic fleet. There is still the danger that Iran may direct a portion of repatriated funds to finance terrorist activity or further destabilize the Middle East. That is why it is critical that the agreement leaves in place our sanctions pertaining to terrorist financing, human rights, and weapons of mass destruction. As noted by the Nonpartisan Congressional Research Service, the many U.S. sanctions that will remain include those specified by Executive Order 13224, issued by President Bush following the 9/11 terrorist attacks, and authorizing the U.S. government to block the assets of foreign entities and individuals that support terrorist organizations. Chief among them is the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which the State Department has deemed the regime's primary mechanism for cultivating and supporting terrorists abroad. Iran's designation as a state sponsor of terrorism will also stay in effect along with the array of sanctions that accompany it, from export controls and prohibitions on arms sales to withholding economic assistance. The nuclear agreement also includes a snapback mechanism to reimpose sanctions in the event that Iran cheats. Mr. Chairman, I look forward to discussing with today's witnesses how we might build upon the Iran nuclear agreement, the purpose of which, as stated in the preface of the agreement, that we can all support, and that is, quote, and I'm quoting for the agreement, that under no circumstances will Iran ever seek, develop, or acquire any nuclear weapons. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Thank you. I will hold the record open for 5 legislative days for any members who would like to submit a written statement. We're going to recognize our panel of witnesses. We look like we're going to have votes called in about an hour, so my hope is if you stay to the 5 minutes, we will then do our questioning, and hopefully we can get everyone, or definitely most people, in, because I'd hate to have to recess and come back. I know you guys have a lot to do. So first, I'm pleased to welcome Lieutenant General Thomas McInerney, United States Air Force, retired, member of the Iran Policy Committee, Dr. Jonathan Shanzer, Vice President for Research at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, Dr. Stephen Bucci, Director of the Center for Foreign and National Security Policy at the Heritage Foundation, and Mr. Ali Reza Nader, Senior International Policy Analyst at the RAND Corporation. Welcome to you all. Pursuant to committee rules, all witnesses will be sworn in before they testify, so if you please stand and raise your right hands. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Witnesses, thank you. Please be seated. All witnesses answered in the affirmative. Your entire written statement will be made part of the record, so please limit your testimony to 5 minutes. Lieutenant General McInerney, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman DeSantis, Ranking Member Lynch, members of the Subcommittee on National Security. Thank you for the opportunity to give you my concerns on this important subject to our nation's current and future national security in the Middle East. The Iran nuclear agreement, or as it is officially titled, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Agreement, is the most dangerous nuclear agreement ever signed by an American president. Its impact on Iran's ability to dominate the Arabian Peninsula and force project in the future is profound. I hearken back to my days on active duty when I commanded a U.S. Air Force Europe task force to a CENTO exercise in Iran in 1977, F-4s and 6-111s flying out of Shiraz, Iran. The Shah of Iran was highly motivated in expanding stability in the region, until the Carter administration threw him under the bus, as the current administration has done in Egypt, Libya, and Syria, as well as enabling the Iranians to make Iraq a proxy with our withdrawal in 2011. I say this for the following reasons. Having read the document in full, one can make a reasonable case that it limits Iranian nuclear weapons development over the short term with some reasonable oversight procedures. However, these are just words similar to what Neville Chamberlain produced in September 1938, and yet a year later, excuse me, World War II started and 60 million lives were lost. My point is that words might be acceptable if we believe that Iran was a trustful partner in this agreement, yet the mullahs have never observed an agreement in the past. This agreement should be a formal treaty in accordance with our Constitution. The Senate has not yet had a vote to approve it. There is no coupling with the agreement in Iran's proxy force projection of its radical Islamic terror activities globally. Iran has already made violations of the agreement even before it was approved. These violations include the visit of General Soleimani to Moscow, where he met President Putin and leaders in violation of UN sanctions to discuss the sale of the S-300 SAM. They intentionally violate agreements, and nothing happens. The Iranians launched a nuclear-capable IRBM on 10 October 2015 in violation of UN Security Council Resolution 1929. No action has been taken against them. Now, several months after the agreement was reached in July, the Russians projected forces into Syria to keep Bashar Assad in power and attacked Free Syrian Army's forces supported by the U.S.-led coalition. The PRC is now supporting the Assad government. Is something wrong with this picture of Iranian bad behavior being supported by Russia and China after the agreement was signed? Israel, who has the most to lose with this agreement, is now facing a third intifada instigated by Iran. In the meantime, with the growing radical Islamic threat, This administration has been unilaterally disarming the U.S. military ever since they came into office, starting in April 2009 with the cancellation of the F-22, the Next Generation bomber, the missile defense system in Poland and the Czech Republic, and withdrawing prematurely from a stabilized Iraq, which has resulted in the creation of ISIS in 2009. The administration shifted U.S. policy shortly after the President's Cairo speech, where he had Muslim Brotherhood members in the front row. President Mubarak was not invited, which resulted in the Muslim Brotherhood, a radical Islamic organization, taking over Egypt until the Egyptian people and General al-Sisi threw them out. It further created instability in the Middle East by attacking Libya to remove Colonel Gaddafi without congressional authorization. This resulted in the deaths of 4 Americans on 11 September 2012 when the U.S. consulate was attacked. No American military response was forthcoming. Today, a land and air bridge from Iran goes through Iraq that the Russians and Iranians are using to reinforce Syria in violation of the UN Security Council. This is the most dangerous situation ever in the Middle East. I am skeptical of the Iranians agreeing to follow this nuclear agreement. They will continue to project forces throughout the region to spread radical Islam, which the administration calls violent extremism. I know not the ideology of violent extremism, but I do know the ideology of radical Islam, the Quran, Hadith, and Sharia law. In summary, I am very concerned we have signed an agreement that will rival Neville Chamberlain's failed agreement and encourage more Iranian force projection. Who could have predicted 7 years ago we would leave a vacuum for Russian reemergence into the region, and Iran would be the de facto hegemon? Thank you for your time, and God bless you all during these very difficult times for America.
Thank you, General. Chair now recognizes Mr. Shanzer for 5 minutes.
Chairman DeSantis, Ranking Member Lynch, members of the subcommittee, on behalf of FDD and its Center on Sanctions and Illicit Finance, I thank you for the opportunity to testify. Iran has long projected power through the financing of its proxies around the Middle East. This strategy figures prominently in Iran's plans for regional hegemony. The nuclear deal signed this summer will now provide Iran with an estimated $120 billion in sanctions relief and another $18 billion in annual oil sales. The White House insists Iran will invest this windfall in roads, schools, hospitals, and other neglected infrastructure. But this is wishful thinking, given Iran's track record. Even if Iran earmarks only 10% for its proxies, we're looking at more than $10 billion in illicit finance. The beneficiaries of Iran's largesse will include terrorist groups Hamas, Hezbollah, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Kataib Hezbollah, and other violent factions in Iraq, and now Sabirin, a new Shiite group in Gaza. On top of that, we can expect continued assistance to the Assad regime in Syria, which continues to drop barrel bombs on its own population. And let's not forget the Houthis, who continue to play a destabilizing role in Yemen. Iran's sanctions relief will further benefit Iran's hardliners who bankroll those terror groups and rogue regimes. This includes the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, which will see many of its sanctioned entities delisted in Europe. Sanctions relief will further benefit companies belonging to the supreme leader himself. I'm referring here to Ali Khamenei's economic empire known as ICO. Mr. Chairman, all of this raises troubling questions about the U.S. Treasury's mission. It was a little more than a year ago when the New York Times' David Sanger wrote about Treasury sanctions team as President Obama's favorite non-combatant command. The moniker was well-deserved. The Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence played a crucial role, along with Congress, in building the sanctions architecture that punished Iran for its nuclear mendacity, ballistic missile development, the funding of terror groups, human rights abuses, and the backing of rogue states. Above all else, Treasury's mandate was to protect the integrity of the U.S.-led financial sector. But that mandate is now in jeopardy. The banks, businesses, and persons set to be delisted haven't earned it. Iran has provided no evidence that they have ceased their illicit activities. And once they are delisted, the terms of the Iran deal forbid them from being relisted, even if they commit new financial crimes. And the $120 billion in sanctions relief will flow regardless of Iran's regional activity. In the end, Treasury's principles were compromised to secure President Obama a diplomatic victory, and it's doubtful that this will be a lasting one. For Treasury's mission to be taken seriously, it must now be able to resume its campaign against Iranian financial crimes and to punish Iran for violations of the nuclear deal. How it will do this, given the constraints of the Iran deal, is unclear. Mr. Chairman, the road ahead will be challenging, but I offer several recommendations here for the committee's consideration. Number one, Treasury needs to reaffirm its mission. Congress should request a roadmap from the Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence. Treasury must now articulate how it plans to continue to be an effective noncombatant command under these new challenging circumstances. Number two, change the way Treasury designates. Treasury usually targets illicit financial actors by designating them pursuant to one executive order such as terrorism or human rights or proliferation. But in the case of Iran, illicit actors are often guilty of many financial crimes. Congress should demand that Treasury designate more entities under multiple executive orders simultaneously, making it harder for them to delist. Number three, enforce what we have left. Congressional oversight over what relevant sanctions architecture remains is crucial to stemming the flow of Iranian illicit finance. The rigorous enforcement of existing executive orders and the creation of new ones when appropriate will be vital to curbing Iranian support for terrorism. Number four, enforce and expand designations of IRGC-affiliated entities. Congress should direct Treasury to designate the IRGC in its entirety under Executive Order 13224 for its role in financing, directing, and supporting international terrorism. It is currently designated for proliferation and human rights purposes, while only the Quds Force, an IRGC subsidiary, is designated for terrorism. And number five, lower the threshold for IRGC designations. Congress should consider making it easier to designate IRGC companies. The Financial Action Task Force suggests that the threshold could be 25% controlled, and that could include both members of the board and stakeholders. Mr. Chairman, on behalf of FDD and its Center on Sanctions and Illicit Finance, thank you again for inviting me to testify. If I've missed anything that you wish to discuss, I'm happy to answer your questions.
Thank you. Dr. Bucci, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, members of the subcommittee. I'm the Director of the Allison Center for Foreign and National Security Policy at the Heritage Foundation. The views I express in this testimony are my own, and should not be construed as representing any official position of the Foundation. I retired from the Army as a Special Forces Colonel, having served as a human intelligence collector for DIA and as the commander of 3rd Battalion, 5th Special Forces Group in the CENTCOM AOR. I later served as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Homeland Defense. My focus here will be the threat that we face from Iran and their efforts to project power and impose its extreme and abhorrent will on the world. The majority of my written testimony is taken from the Heritage Foundation's recently released 2016 Index of U.S. Military Strength. The immediate threat is the IRGC Quds Force terrorism. The IRGC is a very capable organization that matches its operational expertise in guerrilla warfare, terror, and murder with an ideological purity that makes their only comparable analog the old Soviet Spetsnaz. They have done operations around the Middle East and the world, including the attempted murder of the Saudi ambassador here in Washington, D.C. Down the road, Iran will gain considerable capability in ballistic missiles. They will undoubtedly gain nuclear weapons eventually. They will definitely re-equip their conventional forces with the help of the Russians. The real key here, though, is the orders of magnitude greater and more dangerous terror events that the Quds Force can fund and execute, given their share of the soon-to-be-released $100 billion in new money. There is no sequestration pending for the IRGC. The windows of heaven, or hell, are about to open for them. Iran is an anti-Western revolutionary state that seeks to tilt the regional balance of power in its favor by driving out the Western presence, particularly the United States, undermining and overthrowing opposing governments, and establishing its hegemony over the region. It also seeks to radicalize Shia communities and advance their interests against Sunni rivals. Iran has a long record of sponsoring terrorist attacks against American allies and other interests. With regard to conventional capabilities, Iran's ground forces dwarf the relatively small armies of the other Gulf states. Importantly, Iran has adapted a strategy that emphasizes irregular warfare, asymmetric tactics, and the extensive use of proxy forces. The IRGC has supported and collaborated with a wide variety of radical Shia and Sunni militant groups, as well as Arab, Palestinian, Kurdish, and Afghan groups that do not even share its radical Islamist ideology. The Quds Force has trained and armed numerous proxies, particularly Lebanese Hezbollah, the Iraqi Shia militias, Palestinian groups such as Hamas and Islamic Jihad, and groups that have fought against the governments of Afghanistan, Bahrain, Egypt, Israel, Iraq, Jordan, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Yemen. Iran is the world's foremost sponsor of terrorism and has made extensive efforts to export its brand of radical Shia Islamist revolution. One cannot discuss Iran's ability to project power without looking more closely at its main proxy. Hezbollah is a close ally of, frequent surrogate for, and terrorist subcontractor for Iran's revolutionary Islamist regime. Tehran provides the bulk of Hezbollah's foreign support, arms, training, logistical support, and money. Iran provides at least 100 to possibly 200 million annually in financial support to Hezbollah. I expect this to grow substantially. Iran presents a significant threat to U.S. national security interests in the Middle East, to our key allies, and to our position as the balancer and influencer there. It has the ability to project power around the world and around the region, particularly in asymmetric forms. The recent collusion of Iran with Russia gives Iran additional abilities to move around the world and do significant mischief. As mentioned, there is no sequestration for the biggest purveyors of state-sponsored terrorism in the world. With respect to the Secretary of State and his comments, you cannot logically separate Iran's terrorism from the JCPOA. It is a mistake to underestimate either the intentions or capabilities of Iran to do harm. Iran is not our partner, but they are a clear adversary. Thank you.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes Mr. Nader for 5 minutes.
Chairman DeSantis, Ranking Member Lynch, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to appear before you today to speak about the impact of sanctions relief on the Iranian regime's policies at home and in the Middle East. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action between Iran and the P5+1 will no doubt provide Iran with significant sanctions relief and alleviate some of the stresses faced by the Iranian economy. But several factors will constrain the Iranian regime's ability to substantially grow the economy and use newly found resources to achieve its foreign policy objectives. First, sanctions relief will not be granted unless Iran sharply reduces its nuclear capabilities. This means that Iran will be unable to use its nuclear program to expand its regional influence. Iran will only be rewarded economically once it has met its obligations under the nuclear agreement. Second, while the United States will lift secondary sanctions against Iran, primary American sanctions targeting the Iranian regime's support for terrorism and its human rights abuses will remain, preventing Iran from gaining access to American capital and, most importantly, American technology and know-how. Although the nuclear agreement is expected to provide Iran with significant economic relief, the amounts involved are unlikely to greatly empower the Iranian regime at home or abroad. The regime is massively indebted due to its costly nuclear policies. It owes as much as $100 billion to Iranian banks and private firms. The Rouhani government was elected on a campaign to improve the economy, which will require Iran to spend at least $200 billion on its decrepit energy sector, in addition to tens of billions of dollars on domestic infrastructure, healthcare, and the educational system. So while the lifting of U.S. secondary and European nuclear sanctions may enable Iran to increase its oil exports and give it access to $50 to $100 billion held in escrow accounts, much of this money will be used to pay debts and invest in the country's infrastructure and social services. In addition, because global oil prices are likely to remain low for the foreseeable future, oil exports will not enable Iran to get rich quickly. Iran faces stiff global competition, and its re-entry into the global market is unlikely to pose serious competition to major oil producers such as Saudi Arabia. Even after the nuclear agreement, many foreign companies will be hesitant to trade with Iran due to remaining U.S. sanctions and, perhaps more importantly, due to the overall reputation of the Iranian regime. Iran is one of the most corrupt and least business-friendly countries in the world. The Iranian regime's asymmetric capabilities will remain the key challenge for U.S. interests. But increasing U.S. military leverage in Syria and Iraq and a political solution to the Syrian conflict decrease the regional instability which the Iranian regime exploits. The United States should be willing to engage Iran diplomatically when it suits its own interests. Iran appears ascendant in Syria today, but it is more eager to end its involvement in the conflict than it may appear. I have 4 recommendations for the United States, especially Congress. Congress has a vital role to play in ensuring Iran's adherence to the nuclear agreement by engaging in vigorous oversight of the agreement's implementation. Congress should be ready to impose new sanctions against Iran if it is found to be violating the agreement. Moreover, Congress should remain fully informed of the status of the nuclear agreement by holding frequent hearings regarding its implementation. However, Congress should not pass new legislation on terrorism and human rights abuses, especially as the nuclear agreement is implemented. Such steps could be viewed by U.S. partners and the international community as an attempt to undermine the nuclear agreement, endangering international enforcement of sanctions against Iran. The nuclear agreement will not end the rivalry between the United States and the Islamic Republic. The Rouhani government is very limited in its ability or willingness to reform Iran. A U.S. focus on democracy promotion would therefore be beneficial. The United States should make it easier for Iranian students to study at American universities, allowing them to gain an even more positive view of the United States and its values. U.S. programs that aim to increase cultural and sports exchanges between Iran and the United States should be expanded. Finally, U.S. diplomacy with Iran can help resolve regional crises while strengthening positive views of America within Iran. Therefore, the United States should lift restrictions against diplomatic engagement with Iranian diplomats. U.S. diplomacy with Iran does not confer legitimacy on the Iranian regime. Such legitimacy can only be conferred by the Iranian people. Thank you for the opportunity to share my views with the subcommittee. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. The Chair now recognizes himself for 5 minutes. Dr. Bucci, Mr. Nader stated in his written testimony that the amount of sanctions relief is, quote, unlikely to greatly empower the Iranian regime at home or abroad, and he said that they will likely use it to pay down debts and follow through with President Rouhani's promises to invest in the country. Do you agree that that's how Iran is likely to spend the money it receives from sanctions relief?
With due respect to my colleague, Mr. Chairman, I think that's wildly optimistic. Clearly, they will apply some of the money. That's a ton of money they're going to get suddenly injected into their economy. Some of it will go to pay some debt. Some of it will go to some infrastructure things. They've got a considerable domestic ferment there that they need to address. But thinking a regime that, under the sanctions, was spending as much money as they were spending on support of terrorism, to think they're not going to siphon off at least some of that money, maybe a big chunk of it, to upgrade that support of terrorism once they get this new money, is delusional.
And their proxies like Hezbollah have cheered the agreement, and I don't think they would do that unless they saw benefits for them as a result of it. Dr. Shanzer, Mr. Nader agrees with you, or this is respect to the increase in oil exports of $1 million per year. He agrees with that, but he argues that Iran will use this additional income to pay debts and invest in the country's infrastructure and social services. So what do you believe, just based on the history of human rights abuses that we've seen under the Supreme Leader, we've seen the regime's conduct, that oil money, what's your best guess as to what's going to happen with that?
Mr. Chairman, look, I would just say this as an overall observation, that those who are proponents of the regime all of a sudden are also accountants and purport to know how Iran is going to spend its money. We've seen during the time when Iran was building its nuclear weapons capability that it was spending money not paying down its debts. Obviously, it was pursuing a reckless policy then. I don't expect it to change a policy of recklessness, even though they have, at least for now, decided to curb their nuclear objective. So I would certainly expect to see oil funds as well as the sanctions relief flowing to groups like Hezbollah, Kataib Hezbollah in Iraq, a lot of the other groups there that are fighting on behalf of the Iranians. I would expect to see the IRGC getting huge amounts of this. But one other thing that's incredibly important to note is that the IRGC controls roughly a third of the Iranian economy. And so when you talk about money that is going to flow to hospitals and schools and roads, what you're doing is you're sinking money into companies controlled by the IRGC. So it's simply a pass-through to this radical organization, which will then go and finance all these radical groups around the region.
Thank you. Lieutenant General McInerney, as a result of this deal, you sketched out kind of Iran's malign influence. Does this deal make their project in, say, Yemen easier for them or more difficult for them?
It makes it much easier, Mr. Chairman.
And how about their project? I know that they have designs on Bahrain. Is this better for Iran and their designs on Bahrain, or does it make their life more difficult with respect to those ambitions?
Again, better for their designs on Bahrain.
And we've talked about, and I think you pointed this out in your testimony very, very well. We talk about, hey, Iran, yeah, they get this entire nuclear infrastructure. It's basically being kept in place. They got the heavy water reactor, but they've promised that there's not going to be any plutonium production. Yeah, they have an underground facility at Iraq, but they're going to, or at Fordow, excuse me, but they promise, they're just going to do research there. So you have words on the paper, true. In your judgment, do you think it's likely that you will see the type of unfettered inspections that you need? I know in some of the military sites, they're essentially going to self-inspect. So are the words on the paper something that, we would want to hang our hats on?
Mr. Chairman, they celebrated their 36th anniversary of seizing our embassy yesterday. I expect no changes in their conduct.
Let me ask you this. I think Dr. Shanzer made some good recommendations about what Congress can do in terms of the financing. What would you say? I mean, people, two-thirds of the American people I've seen don't think this is a good idea. What should Congress do? This was never passed by Congress. It's essentially an executive-to-executive agreement that will expire with a new administration. But in the meantime, what would you recommend that Congress do to combat the threat?
I would increase the sanctions, as Dr. Shanzer mentioned. We have got to put bounds on that nation, and we are not. We are encouraging bad behavior.
Dr. Bucci, what should we do if we agree with your testimony? We think this is a problem. We think Iran, the net effect of this, Iran is stronger, more of a malign force than they've already been. It hurts our national security interests. But yet, we can't really, we voted the agreement down, but it didn't matter. It's going forward as an executive agreement.
Mr. Chairman, I think you ought to take whatever steps you think you can get away with to put the clamps back on, particularly the Quds Force people. General Soleimani, he's catting around the world, going into Moscow to chat with Vladimir Putin. Those kind of things that are now legitimate under this agreement. That's such a slap in the face of the people that have been killed by this man's troops and his plots. Those kind of sanctions, very specific, very directive, at least ought to be put back in place.
And I would venture to guess that Soleimani, of any living person, probably has more American blood on his hands than anyone. I mean, Osama bin Laden has been killed. He killed at least hundreds of our troops in Iraq. I've heard as many as 1,500. Does that, in general, do you think that sounds a reasonable estimate?
Well, I've heard a number between 500 and 1,500.
So this is, relieving international sanctions of somebody that's not just a malign influence, but has actually killed a lot of Americans. And we've had people come to Congress who were wounded by these EFPs that Iran was providing, these Shiite militias. And it's not a story, I think, that is as well known as the Sunni insurgency during that time period. The one thing I would also mention, and we're working on some legislation, but because this was not ratified as a treaty or even passed as Congress as statutory law, what the President has agreed to cannot supersede State sanctions. It's not the supreme law of the land. And so we have states, I'm from Florida, that has pretty tough in terms of the investments in Iran and what can be doing with the pension funds. And we're going to be introducing some legislation hopefully soon that will allow really saving the state sanctions, making it clear and really encouraging states that they should do what's right for their folks. And so those states and those states that have acted are really probably thought. With that, I'm out of time, and I will recognize the ranking member, Mr. Lynch, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. America has always been somewhat forward-looking, and I think that the examples in our history where We've had tremendous loss of life within our nation in wars against Germany, against Japan, against Vietnam, and now we've got trade agreements, and we're trying to move forward with those relationships. And I think that while there's need for great caution here, no question about it, and I do not trust the Iranian regime, I think there's an opportunity here that's been created not by just the United States, but by the P5+1. So we've got to consider the implications here. I think that the verification protocols have to be in place. They have to be robust. Mr. Nader, I want to ask you about the state of the Iranian economy and the impact of whatever money pours over. Some say $100 billion, some say $200 billion into the Iranian economy. We've had a chance to talk to the IAEA inspectors who have been in Tehran and around the country. They tell me that they're afraid to fly commercially within Iran because our sanctions, together with the Europeans and others, we've blocked basic commercial airline parts as part of our sanctions, so that the IAEA inspectors, the way they operate is they fly directly on Lufthansa mostly from Germany into Tehran. They will not fly around the country because they're deathly afraid of the safety conditions of the Iranian commercial airlines. They've also indicated that this petro-economy, and Iran is basically, gas and oil. That's a huge part of their economy. That has been devastated by the sanctions, which was the whole idea to get them to the table. What do you think the impact of this money? And let me have any of the financial sanctions been lifted so far? Has any of the money gone to? So nothing yet. So we've got a parade of horribles that might happen, but nothing has gone. And why is that? Why has no money gone to Iran yet?
Well, first of all, Iran has not implemented the nuclear agreement. Once it implements the nuclear agreement and the IAEA verifies that Iran has taken these steps and they're verifiable, then Iran will meet with some sanctions relief. But I think it's important to recognize that a lot of U.S. sanctions are going to remain against Iran. You mentioned Iran's civilian airlines. They've been without modern technology and parts for decades. Iran's natural gas industry, and Iran has one of the biggest gas reserves in the world, cannot take advantage of the resources because of U.S. sanctions preceding the nuclear sanctions. So if you look at the long list of U.S. sanctions, a lot of sanctions, the primary sanctions, will remain against Iran. A lot of companies will be hesitant to trade with Iran and deal with Iran. And when we look at Iran's conventional military capabilities, under the JCPOA, Iran will face a 5-year embargo on its conventional arms imports. It will face an 8-year embargo on its missiles. And even after that, the U.S. primary sanctions are going to deter a lot of foreign countries from selling equipment to Iran. Even before the nuclear issue became such a problem, Iran was having a difficult time importing sophisticated weapons because the Europeans and even the Russians and Chinese were hesitant to deal with Iran. So I think there are going to be a lot of restraints on Iran and its economy moving forward. And finally, I want to say that yes, this regime will support terrorism. It will deny human rights to its people. But it's important that we have a nuclear agreement which takes the nuclear capability away from the Iranian regime. And I think this is why this agreement is important. It's a strong non-proliferation agreement that will ensure Iran does not have a nuclear weapons capability.
The latent capability of the Iranian regime really lies in oil and gas. I know that oil, there are some who say that there's an oil glut now, that's why prices are down, but the natural gas piece there is a concern because there's a greater use around the world, people are getting away from coal and oil to some respect, but natural gas, that could be a bonanza for Iran. How far behind are they? How long would it take? I know we have there are already contracts in place with a lot of the European countries and the United States with Qatar, for example. They've already rebuilt their whole natural gas infrastructure, and they've not cornered the market, but they've got a huge advantage there. What would it require for Iran to sort of catch up, because they're actually pre-LNG still back in Iran. They haven't even come forward with that technology. So could you talk about how much time it might take them to catch up?
Well, if you compare Iran to Qatar, it's years, if not decades, behind. And Iran and Qatar share a very large gas field, the South Pars gas field. And Qatar has really taken advantage of it because it is a close U.S. ally. It has access to liquefied natural gas technology through the United States, and Iran lacks that technology. And I doubt that it will be able to catch up anytime soon because of U.S. primary sanctions against Iran. And I think a lot of European companies and even Asian companies will be reluctant to help Iran develop its natural gas resources. So Iran is years, if not decades, behind its natural gas. And in terms of its energy sector, when you compare it to Saudi Arabia, for example, or Russia, it is also years and decades behind. I talked to an economist who had worked on Iran's petroleum industry during the Shah's reign. And at that time, it was relatively modern. And when he saw Iran's current status, he said it brought tears to his eyes as an engineer and scientist because how behind Iran had fallen because of the regime's policies, because of its nuclear policies, and its reputation overall.
Thank you. Thank the Chairman for the indulgence. I appreciate that.
No problem. The Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Heiss, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, each of our witnesses, for being here. It's my understanding from your testimony, what you've shared at this point, yes or no, would you agree that if the sanctions are lifted, that Iran will most likely probably use a significant portion of that revenue to advance their military strategy?
I concur with that, sir.
I do as well.
Okay.
Absolutely, yes.
Yes, I think you'll use some of it to gain military power.
All right. Dr. Bushey, let me go with you. Any idea how many American lives have been lost since 2001 in Iraq and Afghanistan?
Total is up about 8,000, I think.
Okay. Any idea how many have been killed by specifically Iranian activity?
The number that gets batted around that the General mentioned, up around 1,500, is generally associated with the use of the Iranian-provided shaped penetrators, the sort of enhanced IEDs that were provided to specifically the Shia militias. I think you need to go a little beyond that because it's not just the IEDs that kill people. There were bullets that kill people. Sure. There were advanced sniper rifles that were given to those same Shia militias by Iran that also killed American service members. So I would guess it's more than the 1,500 that people generally quote.
All right, so if you had to give one weapon, what's the key weapon that's been used against Americans?
The enhanced penetrating IEDs.
Okay, is that produced in Iran?
Absolutely.
Okay. In an interview with the British paper, The Telegraph, there were a couple of British military officers who allegedly said that Iran had paid Taliban fighters $1,000 each for each American soldier that they killed in Afghanistan. Is this accurate?
I have not seen proof of that, Congressman, but I have seen pretty good proof that the Iranians were paying the Taliban salaries, in some cases over $500 a month, which is a pretty hefty salary in Afghanistan. So whether they were doing it as a direct bounty or just the general funding of their operations, it's still pretty significant.
All right, so they're funding the Taliban soldiers against us. In your experience, what's the greatest threat Iran poses to American ground forces?
the exportation of terrorism around the Middle East. None of our people are essentially safe anywhere in the Middle East that the Quds Force can reach them, and that's pretty much the entire region.
Would you agree that regardless of an agreement being reached, that Iran is still going to be a threat to both American interests and our allies?
Not only is it my opinion that they will be so, Congressman, the Iranians have said they will be. They have said they will not back off on any of those type of operations or policies regardless of this agreement.
Specifically, what kind of threat does Hezbollah pose to Israel?
They are the supplied, the best equipped, the best organized. While they're tied up in Syria right now, that's frankly gaining them additional equipment and experience that they could then turn around and apply against Israel. So they are by far the biggest threat.
And I would assume that same threat would carry over to America as well.
Oh, definitely.
All right. So what level of support has Iran contributed to the funding, training, support, so forth of Hezbollah?
They're pretty much 100% of Hezbollah's support comes directly from Iran.
So is it fair to say that, at least in your opinion, if the sanctions are lifted, Hezbollah is going to see a significant boost in its financial backing?
They will benefit Hezbollah, Hamas, and other terrorist groups around the Middle East. They will all gain from this largesse of the Quds Force.
Okay. Dr. Shanzer, you had mentioned a while ago, and I'd like to get a little more information about ICO. Can you give a little bit more information as to what that is?
Absolutely. That is a $95 billion fund owned by the Supreme Leader, Ali Khamenei. It includes a big chunk of the Iranian stock market, I think 5 or 10%. On top of that, significant real estate holdings, international holdings as well. We had sanctions on it. It's set to be delisted now as a result of this deal.
Okay. Again, I want to thank you for being here, each of you, and my time has expired. I appreciate it very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from Michigan for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Nader, is it true that while this agreement was announced in July, it was technically adopted on October 18, 2015? So, a couple questions. Iran is now expected to begin nuclear disarmament. Is that right? So, technically adopted October 18, 2015, and so now the disarmament is expected to begin. And as I understand it, the next milestone will be Implementation Day. Is that correct? Can you explain what Implementation Day is?
Sure. Once the nuclear agreement was adopted, which you mentioned, Iran is expected to implement the agreement over the next few months. And that entails Iran undertaking actions that block all the paths toward nuclear weaponization. That means severely restricting its uranium enrichment program, reducing its centrifuges that spend uranium by 2/3, by reducing its stockpile of its enriched uranium by 97%, by reconfiguring the Iraq facility that could produce plutonium for nuclear weapons, so that would block Iran's plutonium weapons production. And also Iran would accept very intrusive inspections into its nuclear facilities. From the bottom up, the IAEA and the United States will have a very good idea of what Iran is up to. So when Iran is building these centrifuges in its factories, we'll know where it is building them and what they're doing with the centrifuges. So if they want to pursue a covert program and take these centrifuges, we'll know what's going on. And these actions are expected to give us about a year warning if Iran decides to produce breakout, meaning that if Iran races toward a nuclear weapon, if it decides to violate the agreement, then we'll know and we'll have the ability to respond, whether economically, diplomatically, and militarily. So in terms of implementation, once Iran implements the agreement, the nuclear program is going to be under very close monitoring and inspection. And that's what really the international community has asked Iran to do for the past 10 years.
Thank you. I've heard estimates for the implementation date could be as soon as the end of the year or as far off as next spring. Is that correct?
Yes, it could take a few months.
Now, the sanctions are not to be lifted until everything Iran has done has been physically verified as complete by the IAEA, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Now, I understand that the implementation day, only nuclear-related sanctions will be removed. You mentioned it, but could you just restate what are some of the other, because I understand the remaining conventional arms and ballistic sanctions are to be removed in phases. So could you please give some information on that?
According to JCPOA, Iran will still face a 5-year embargo on the import of conventional weapons. So no country can sell conventional weapons to Iran for 5 years. If they do, they'll be punished and sanctioned. For 8 years, no other country can help Iran develop its missile program. If any countries or companies help Iran with this missile program, they'll be punished and sanctioned. And once the nuclear sanctions against Iran are eased, you still have a number of U.S. sanctions that date from 1979 to the Iranian Revolution, whether you're looking at the freezing of Iranian assets, Iran Sanctions Act that dates from the 1990s, sanctions against the Revolutionary Guards and the Quds Force, those will remain. The American sanctions will remain against terrorism and human rights abuses. And although the European Union is expected to lift its nuclear sanctions against Iran, its human rights abuses sanctions will also still remain. And a lot of the European countries do care about human rights and look at human rights in terms of investing in Iran.
So in the last few minutes I agree with the statements that have been provided by our distinguished panel. There are some bad guys in Iran. They're not a friend of the United States. This nuclear agreement is directed toward a verified system of stopping Iran from getting the nuclear weapons. And we have just begun to this process so that we can examine, verify before any sanctions will be lifted. Is that correct?
Yes, exactly.
Okay. Thank you. I yield my time.
Gentleman's time's expired. The Chair now recognizes the Vice Chair of the committee, Mr. Russell from Oklahoma, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, panel, for being here. Mr. Nader, you've said both in your testimony and in answers to questions that no one that is on the terror and human rights list will have sanctions lifted. Yet I, like General McInerney, have read the entire agreement, have researched every single name on the sanctions list. I have personally discovered over 50 individuals and entities that have violated terror and human rights, yet they are listed for sanctions relief. For example, General Soleimani, General Salami, General Hazaji, the Quds Force, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the Islamic Republic of Iran shipping lines, a known shipper of weapons all over the region for terror. So my question is, since the agreement clearly says that these sanctions will be lifted, how can you state that?
Those are the nuclear secondary sanctions. So the secondary sanctions under the nuclear sanctions that the United States has passed compel other countries and companies to stop trading with Iran. And in order to achieve the nuclear agreement, those secondary sanctions will be eased. But when you look at U.S. primary sanctions, for example, Iran is designated as a supporter of terrorism by the United States. It was designated in 1984. That puts a lot of sanctions against Iran and deters foreign companies and countries from trading with Iran. And there are a number of other sanctions that precede the nuclear sanctions going back to 1979. I mean, there are many overlapping U.S. and international
Well,
sanctions
and that is the
against Iran.
concern, and I would invite all of the panel and even, Mr. Chairman, our committee to look at paragraph 37 of Annex 2 in the agreement, because Iran has a much different view about these sanctions liftings, and they believe that these individuals will be wide open for business. And in that regard, Dr. Shanzer, the Islamic Republican Guard Corps, the Quds Force, and others, it has a vast array of business that it conducts. Can you very succinctly describe what it is that its legitimate business reach is? We think it's nefarious, but yet on the other hand, we see that it's conducting itself normal, and it will be able to conduct enterprise in your hometown.
That's right. I mean, look, this was the point that I was trying to make earlier, that the IRGC has deep penetration across just about every sector within Iran. This is construction, it's petrochemical, it's gas. I mean, basically every major sector within Iran has IRGC companies that are set to benefit from this. And this is one of the reasons why we've placed such a huge focus on targeting the IRGC itself, lowering the threshold for designating IRGC businesses to make it harder for our money to flow there. But there is one other thing that I think it's worth noting. We keep hearing that we have not lifted any sanctions yet. That is untrue.
I agree.
That after the signing of the JPOA, the interim agreement, back in November of 2013, we began to provide Iran with $700 million per month. We lifted sanctions on gold, petrochemicals, auto, a range of other sectors, and that has allowed Iran to benefit from this deal even before we signed it. And so it's just simply not true to say that we have not provided them with sanctions relief to this point.
Well, I appreciate that. And General McInerney, you won't remember me, but we served together when you were the Joint Task Force Alaska commander, and I was the aide to General Sam Ebbison when General Tom Fields was there. And it's good to see you again after all
You were
these
dressed
years.
differently, sir.
I was indeed, sir, and thank you for being here. Sir, can you speak to the Iran's missile and cruise missile threats and the development of the underground silos and what the implication of that is?
Briefly, sir, they are missiles' primary value is in the nuclear realm. So they are leading the problem and developing conventional. And we just noticed on 10th of October, 15, less than a month ago, that they launched an IRBM. And they're going to continue to progress. They're getting help from China, North Korea, and Russia. Now, their eventual goal is to put nuclear weapons on these. And we have seen the ability, when you then have that capability, and then when you go to underground silos as well as the Chinese have, where they have roads underneath, you then have the ability for a nation like Iran to hold hostage Europe, the United States, other parts of the world, and that comes back to them when they're negotiating. When you're negotiating and you're looking at a person you're negotiating with, and he said, and he doesn't have to say it, but you know he has nuclear weapons that he can put on your cities, that changes the tone of the negotiations. And that is the direction that they are going to. Will it happen next week? No. But that is their long-term objective. And if they're still in power in 36 years from now, we're in trouble.
Thank you for that, General. And Mr. Chairman, my time has expired, but if we have a chance for second round at the end, I would have some more questions. Thank you.
Okay. We still got over 10 minutes on the vote, 410 not voting, so I think we'll be able to get to a couple more. So the Chair now recognizes Ms. Kelly for 5 minutes.
I'll keep it short. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Iran's neighbors, such as Israel and Saudi Arabia, are concerned that the deal is not sufficiently strong and does not prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon. This was a serious concern that warranted consideration prior to enactment. However, now with the deal in place, it is imperative that we move forward and work to ensure that compliance is strictly enforced and any and all sanctions be implemented following noncompliance to ensure those fears remain unwarranted. Mr. Nader, what provisions of the deal hold Iran's feet to the fire to ensure its compliance?
There are many provisions, from Iran having to verify, or the IAEA having to verify that Iran has complied with the program, to the future restrictions in place against Iran for the next 15 years, which is the duration of the program. And then even after 15 years, there are components of the program that last for 20 to 25 years, and able to reassure our allies the United States has provided them with the technology and weaponry to deter Iran's military capabilities. For example, the United States has helped Israel develop a very sophisticated anti-ballistic missile defense system. The same goes for Saudi Arabia and the GCC states. And while those allies have been concerned about Iran's nuclear activities and have been concerned about the negotiations, as they should be because Iran poses a threat to them, they have come to see that the nuclear agreement can be beneficial to their interests. Saudi Arabia and the GCC have approved of the program and are working very closely with the United States to strengthen their conventional military capabilities against Iran.
A shortcoming of the deal many point to is that provisions expire at all. However, to my knowledge, no arms treaty or agreement has ever been without expiration. But in fact, even the much-hailed Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty had an expiration date until it was renewed. Isn't that correct?
Yes. All nonproliferation treaties do have an expiration date. I think what's unique about JCPOA is it does last 15 years, but even after 15 years, the IAEA has a very close inspections regime against Iran's nuclear program. Some of the measures last 20 and 25 years. So from the time Iran mines uranium from the ground to the time it builds its centrifuges and takes them for enrichment, we'll know what it's doing even after the agreement has expired.
Because these provisions do not extend into perpetuity, compliance with the agreement is even more dependent on Iran's domestic politics and leadership. Moving forward, what must Congress do to ensure future Iranian regimes continue to abide by the agreement and we don't have to keep going back to the negotiating table and face the threat of nuclear Iran?
I don't think the Iranian political system is going to change anytime soon. Ayatollah Khamenei still rules Iran as long as he lives. The Revolutionary Guards are a powerful force. But there are millions of Iranians who want change in their country. We saw in 2009 millions of Iranians come into the street in support of democracy. And moving forward, I think there's a lot the United States can do to foster democracy in Iran, whether it's increasing exchanges between Iranians and Americans. And I think that's very important, actually, because Iranians get to come here, see what the United States is like, and not be subject to their government's propaganda. So strengthening civil society, public diplomacy, U.S. broadcast to Iran can all be very helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. The Chair asks unanimous consent to welcome Mr. Welch of Vermont, who's not on the subcommittee, but to allow him to participate in today's hearing. That objection, so ordered. Mr. Welch, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I really appreciated the testimony and the points that you made. We had this fierce debate, obviously, about the nuclear deal. The majority of Congress was against it. The minority was for it. It's been implemented. I did support it, but share a lot of the concerns that have been expressed. And in listening to the testimony and reading beforehand, there's an aspect of what you've said, and I'll start with you, General McInerney, that on one hand cautions us about the future, and we've got to take that seriously. But on the other hand, there's an aspect of it that I hear as a continuation of the fierce debate that we had about the deal itself. The deal's done. So that's not going to be undone realistically. So when you are talking about the sanctions relief, how is it that we would not comply on our part with the sanctions provisions that were part of the nuclear deal, even as we are extremely wary and watchful about what Iran is doing to cause difficulties in an already difficult Middle East situation? In other words, what is it? What's the tool that we have? We have to comply with the agreement, right?
This administration does, yes, sir. Now,
could you just elaborate on that?
Well, this administration that signed it as an executive agreement
Right.
is going to comply with relieving those sanctions when they meet their appropriate endpoints. We think, that we should put, as a Congress, put additional sanctions on certain elements like the Quds Force, IRGC, et cetera.
But let me just understand this, because I think it's important. A lot of people, I think, would probably agree with you, okay? But if the administration signed this agreement, what I'm hearing you say is that the next administration is going to have its own option to review it and perhaps change it. Is that your suggestion?
Yes. As a matter of fact, some of the candidates have already announced that they will cancel it, and that is a clear option. My personal course of action on this altogether would have been never to have the JCPOA, but we should have continued the sanctions, which were very effective, and we have to, in the long run, look for regime change. Remember the difference that this government is. It is a radical Islamic government.
Right.
If you look at Saddam Hussein, he was a Ba'athist. If you look at Bashir al-Assad, he is a Ba'athist, just a strong man.
Yeah, I don't have that much time, but thank you.
Right.
So your view is that the stability that we need will come only through ultimately a regime change in Iran.
Correct.
And Dr. Shanzer, do you agree with that?
I'm not going to speculate as to whether the next president would cancel the deal, but what I can tell you is that there are measures that can be taken in the interim.
But I'm wondering whether you agree with General McInerney that regime change is ultimately the option that is the only option that will really assure us that there'll be stability with respect to Iran.
Look, as long as this regime is in place, you will continue to see the sponsorship of terrorism and other proxies around the region. There's no question about it. We should be working toward regime change. 2009 was a huge missed opportunity.
Okay. Dr. Bucci?
I would agree with that also, Congressman. This regime, as stated publicly, they're actually quite honest about it, that they're not going to give up any of those things. They don't see that they have to with this deal, so they won't. And in fact, the deal will enable those efforts to be stronger and more widespread than they were before. So I think regime change is the only way to achieve stability in that country and in the region.
Right. Now, there were a number of people who agreed with you on that. A number of people disagreed, myself among them, partly on practical grounds. I mean, regime change didn't work out so great in Iraq. But the sanctions, the original sanctions that we had, did not stop the nuclear program. They froze the Iranian assets overseas, but the Iranians proceeded even further along the nuclear program, which means that there's a judgment all of us have to make as to the effect of our actions. And what we hope it will accomplish won't necessarily be the case. General McInerney?
We, with those sanctions, sir, needed to continue our covert operations, which I will just say that if we're in a closed session, we could talk about it.
All right. My time is up. Mr. DeSantis, thank you very much for letting me participate.
Absolutely. I'm going to recognize the Vice Chair. He's got one more question. We're pretty much out of time on the votes, and so we'll do this question, then I think we'll wrap up the hearing.
Thank you for your indulgence, Mr. Chairman. And Dr. Bucci, my last remaining question was for you. Could you speak to the recent activity of the Quds Force and its terrorist activity? And by recent, I mean within the last 2 to 5 years.
Yeah, they tried to kill the Saudi ambassador here in Washington. I think that's within that time period. They hired one of the Shia militia groups in Iraq to rocket the Mech camp that's there, people that were under our protection and the protection of the Iraqi government. They are behind the cyber attacks that the Chairman mentioned at the beginning of the hearing, and the ones who did the attack on Saudi Aramco, where they destroyed 30,000 computers in one day using a very heavy-handed piece of malware. They've done operations in Latin America, Africa, and they're behind the Houthis in Yemen. So they're pretty busy fellows and very, very effective.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, I'd like to thank all of our witnesses for taking the time to appear before us today. If there is no further business, without objection, this subcommittee stands adjourned.